The divorce papers landed on the kitchen counter with a flat, deliberate slap. Not a dramatic throw, nothing like that. Just placed there, like a grocery receipt, like something that didn't matter at all. Brandon didn't even look at me when he did it. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee, his back turned, shoulders loose, completely relaxed, like he hadn't just dropped a grenade between us. "Sign and leave," he said, still not turning around. "You don't owe this house anything anymore." I stood there in my socks on the hardwood floor I had personally picked out from 3 different showrooms, staring at a manila envelope with my full legal name typed on the front, Ashley Marie Caldwell. And I felt something very strange happen inside my chest. Not pain exactly, not shock, something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. Something that felt like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place, revealing a picture you'd been hoping you were wrong about for a very, very long time. 48 hours earlier, I had wired $50,000 from my personal savings account, money I had spent 4 years accumulating, dollar by careful dollar, to the hospital billing department for my mother-in-law's open heart surgery. Linda Caldwell, 63 years old, 2 stents already, a leaky mitral valve that her cardiologist said couldn't wait another month. Insurance covered 60%. The rest, $31,000 after the deductible, fell to the family. And since Brandon had burned through his savings investing in a buddy's food truck that never opened, and since Linda had no liquid assets beyond a small CD that would have taken a penalty to cash out, I had stepped in without hesitation, without negotiation, without a single condition attached. Brandon had hugged me in the hospital parking garage after we got the surgery confirmation. He'd pressed his face into my hair and said, "You saved her life." I'll never forget this. His voice had been thick, cracked at the edges. I believed him completely. 48 hours later, sign and leave. So yeah, that's where this story ends up. But to understand how I got there, how a woman who thought she had a solid marriage, a good man, and a future she'd actually built with her own hands, ended up standing barefoot in her own kitchen holding divorce papers, you need to go back a little further. Because the worst betrayals are never the ones that come out of nowhere. They're the ones you can trace back, step by step, and realize you had every warning sign you needed. You just loved someone too much to read them clearly. Let me take you back about 3.5 years to a Sunday afternoon in October when the leaves on the maples outside our house in Glenview, Illinois were doing that perfect postcard thing. Orange and gold and absolutely ridiculous, like nature was showing off. I was sitting on the back porch with a mug of apple cider, watching our neighbor's golden retriever dig up something disgusting in the yard next door, and thinking, I cannot believe this is actually my life. I was 31. I had a job I genuinely liked, senior project coordinator at a mid-size healthcare consulting firm downtown. Good salary, solid benefits, a 401k I contributed to religiously because my mom had worked retail her whole life and retired with almost nothing, and I had promised myself before I was 25 that I would never be in that position. I drove a 3-year-old Honda CR-V that I'd bought used, paid cash, no debt. I had a savings account with a real number in it. I had a house. Well, Brandon and I had a house, a 4-bedroom colonial in a quiet suburb with good schools and a HOA that was only mildly insane about holiday decorating rules. And I had Brandon. Brandon Caldwell, 34, sales manager at a regional medical equipment distributor, broad shoulders, easy smile, the kind of guy who remembered your coffee order and held doors open, not because he was performing chivalry, but because it just seemed to be wired into him. We'd met at a mutual friend's 4th of July barbecue 3.5 years before that October porch moment. He'd been the one manning the grill, completely unbothered by the chaos of 12 adults and 6 children, all wanting something different, laughing at everything, handing me a plate before I'd even asked for one. "You looked hungry," he'd said, by way of explanation. I looked hungry? "You had that face. The one people get when they're too polite to push to the front of the line, but they're absolutely dying to." I'd laughed so hard I'd almost spilled my lemonade. And that was more or less that. We dated for 1.5 years, moved in together, got engaged on a Tuesday in February, not Valentine's Day, not a fancy restaurant, just a Tuesday, because he said he didn't want it to feel like an obligation, and got married the following September in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside the city. 40 people. My college roommate Jennifer was my maid of honor. Brandon's best man was his brother Kevin, who flew in from Phoenix and gave a toast that made everyone cry, including Brandon, including me. It was, by most reasonable measures, a good marriage. Not a fairy tale. We had regular, unglamorous arguments about things like whose turn it was to call the plumber and whether we actually needed a second streaming subscription. Brandon could be frustratingly passive about household decisions. He had a habit of saying, "whatever you want," to everything, which sounds sweet until you realize it means you're making every single choice alone. And I had my own stuff. I was a worrier, a planner, someone who color-coded her budget spreadsheets and got genuinely anxious when plans changed last minute. But we loved each other. I was certain of that. Or I was certain of what I understood love to be at that point in my life, which is maybe not exactly the same thing. His mother, Linda, lived about 25 minutes away in the same suburb where Brandon had grown up. She was a retired school librarian, sharp and opinionated, with a dry sense of humor I'd come to genuinely appreciate after a rocky first year of figuring each other out. She'd been widowed when Brandon was in college. His dad had died of a sudden cardiac event at 58, which explained both Linda's anxiety about her own heart and the way Brandon flinched slightly every time a medical topic came up in conversation. Linda and I had reached a kind of functional warmth. She wasn't the mother-in-law from a horror story, but she wasn't someone who would have chosen me for her son if she'd been given a catalog to browse either. I was too independent for her taste, too direct, not deferential enough in the ways she'd grown up expecting a daughter-in-law to be. But we'd found our footing. Sunday dinners every couple of weeks, birthday cakes made from scratch, occasional shopping trips that worked better than I'd expected. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And then, 14 months ago, Linda called Brandon on a Wednesday evening, and everything that came after that call leads in one straight, terrible line to that kitchen counter, those divorce papers, and the quietest, most dangerous feeling I have ever had in my life. Brandon took the call in the bedroom with the door closed, which was the first thing. He was in there for almost 40 minutes, which was the second thing. When he came out, his face was different. Not red, not crumpled, just different, flattened somehow, like something behind it had been switched off. "Mom's cardiology appointment," he said. It's not great news." I told him to sit down. He didn't. He stood in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen, one hand still on the doorframe, like he needed something solid to hold on to. And he told me what the cardiologist had said. The mitral valve, the deterioration, the surgery window that was narrowing faster than anyone had anticipated. His voice was steady in the way voices get when someone has spent 40 minutes in a bedroom quietly falling apart and has now put themselves back together just enough to function. "How much?" I asked. He told me the estimate, roughly $50,000 after what insurance would cover. I didn't flinch. I didn't ask how we were going to handle it, or whether there were other options, or whether Linda had any assets we hadn't considered. I just nodded and said, "Okay, I'll move the money." And I watched something enormous move through Brandon's face. Relief, gratitude, something that looked very much like love. And I thought, this is what marriage is. This is the part where you show up. What I did not know then, standing in that kitchen with the sound of the furnace clicking on and the neighbor's dog still barking somewhere outside, was that the conversation Brandon had just had on that phone call was not only with his mother. I would not find that out for another 11 months. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday in late November, 4 days before Thanksgiving. The timing was brutal in the logistical sense. Hospital parking, holiday staff schedules, the weird suspended animation quality that settles over everything in the days before a major American holiday. But the cardiologist had been clear that waiting wasn't a real option anymore. So we made it work. I took 3 days off from the consulting firm. I drove Linda to her pre-op appointments twice because Brandon had a regional sales conference he couldn't get out of without significant professional consequences. Or so he said, and I believed him, because that was the kind of wife I was. I sat with her in the waiting room of her cardiologist's office while she filled out paperwork, and she reached over at one point and put her hand over mine without saying anything. And that gesture hit me harder than anything she'd said to me in 4 years of Sunday dinners. "I know this isn't nothing," she said finally, not looking at me. "What you're doing?" "It's family," I said. She squeezed my hand once and let go. And that was the most Linda had ever given me, and I was glad to have it. The surgery itself went well. 6 hours. A valve repair rather than a replacement, which the surgeon said was the better outcome, less long-term risk. Brandon was there for the surgery, sitting beside me in the waiting area with a cardboard cup of terrible hospital coffee. And when the surgeon came out and gave us the thumbs up, he pulled me in and held me for a long time in that beige hallway that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. I could feel how tightly wound he was, all the fear he'd been holding in his body finally releasing. "She's okay," he kept saying into my hair. "She's okay. You made this happen." I believed every word. The shift was subtle at first. That's the thing about the way trust erodes. It doesn't go all at once, like a wall coming down. It goes grain by grain, so slowly you keep telling yourself you're imagining it. About 6 weeks after Linda's surgery, I noticed Brandon had started putting his phone face down on the counter when he came home. Just that, small enough to explain away. Maybe a notification setting. Maybe he was trying to be more present, something I'd actually mentioned wanting more of. I said nothing. A week after that, he started staying up after I went to bed. I'm a solid 8 hours person. I'm asleep by 10:30 most nights, and I don't apologize for it. For 3 years, Brandon had been the same way. Now he was down on the couch until midnight, sometimes later, and when I asked him about it, he said he'd been having trouble winding down. Work stress, nothing major. I said, "Okay." I should not have said, "Okay." The thing that finally made me stop explaining things away was a Saturday afternoon in January, about 2 months after the surgery. Brandon had told me he was going to his buddy Marcus's place to watch a game. I had no reason not to believe him. He'd been doing that semi-regularly for years. I stayed home, did laundry, meal prepped for the week, called Jennifer and talked for an hour about nothing in particular. Normal Saturday. He came home around 6:30, and he smelled wrong. Not like alcohol or perfume, nothing that obvious. He smelled like a house, like someone else's house. That particular combination of a different laundry detergent and a different heating system and the vague ghost of someone else's cooking that clings to your clothes when you've been somewhere for a few hours, I know that smell. I grew up in a small town where you spent a lot of time at other people's houses and you always came home smelling like them. I didn't say anything. I served dinner. We watched TV, but something in my chest had gone very quiet and very alert, the way it does when your body knows something before your brain is willing to catch up. I started paying closer attention after that, not in a dramatic, installing spyware way, just the way a person does when they've been startled awake, listening harder, noticing more. And what I noticed over the next several weeks was a pattern of small, individually explainable absences that added up to something that didn't have a good explanation. The Saturday game watching that happened almost every week now. The conference calls he took in the car, in the driveway, rather than coming inside. The way he'd started carrying his wallet in his jacket pocket instead of leaving it on the kitchen counter like he had for the entire duration of our marriage. The birthday dinner for his coworker he'd mentioned, then seemed flustered when I asked which coworker, then said it was someone from the new regional office I hadn't met. None of it was proof of anything. All of it felt like a low current of electricity running just below the surface of everything. In February, I found a receipt. It wasn't hidden. That's what got me. It was in the pocket of a jacket I was taking to the dry cleaner, and I checked the pockets the way I always do, And there it was, a receipt from a restaurant about 40 minutes from our house in a town called Millbrook that I'd driven through maybe twice in my life. Dinner for two, $112. On a Tuesday night in January, when Brandon had told me he had a late client dinner downtown. Millbrook is not downtown. Millbrook is 40 minutes in the opposite direction from downtown. I stood in the laundry room holding that receipt for a long time. The dryer was running, the house smelled like fabric softener, everything was completely ordinary, and something had just broken open. I put the receipt back in the pocket. I sent the jacket to the dry cleaner. I did not say anything to Brandon that night or the night after that. I needed to think. I needed to be sure. Because what I was considering was the kind of accusation you don't walk back. And I had spent $50,000 on this man's mother's heart, and I was not going to blow up my marriage on the basis of a restaurant receipt from a town I'd barely heard of without being absolutely, completely, devastatingly certain. So I waited. And then, 3 weeks later, I stopped waiting. I came home from work on a Wednesday to find Brandon's car in the driveway, which was normal, and the kitchen light on, which was normal, and Linda's car also in the driveway, which was not normal. Linda didn't just drop by. Linda called first, always, because she was from a generation that considered unannounced visits to be mildly rude. I'd always appreciated that about her. I stood on the front porch for a moment before going in, my work bag over my shoulder, my keys already in my hand. Through the front window, I could see movement in the kitchen. 2 figures, Brandon and Linda, standing close together, talking. Not arguing, talking quietly, intently, the way people do when they're working something out. I opened the door. They both turned at the same time. Brandon's expression went through about 4 different things in the space of half a second and landed on something that was trying very hard to look normal. Linda looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated, something that looked almost like, "I'm sorry, but I've already chosen." "Hey," Brandon said, "didn't expect you home this early." "I left at 5, I said. I leave at 5 every Wednesday." A beat, just a fraction too long. "Right," he said. "Yeah, Mom just stopped by." "I can see that," I said. I set my bag down on the chair by the door. I looked at Linda. "Everything okay? How are you feeling?" "Fine," she said. Her voice was completely even. "I'm fine, Ashley. Thank you." There was something in that thank you, a period at the end of it that was heavier than a period should be, a closing of a door quality that I couldn't quite name but couldn't stop hearing either. I went upstairs to change out of my work clothes. I took longer than I needed to. And when I came back down, Linda was gone, and Brandon was at the stove pretending to think about dinner. And I understood with absolute cold clarity that whatever conversation had just happened in my kitchen had been about me. I just didn't know yet how deep it went. That night, after Linda left and Brandon stood at the stove pretending to study the contents of the refrigerator like it held the answers to something, I sat at the kitchen table and did something I hadn't done since I was maybe 22 years old. I made a list, on paper, old school, a yellow legal pad I kept in the junk drawer for grocery lists and contractor notes. I wrote down every single thing I had noticed over the past 2 months. The phone face down on the counter, the late nights on the couch, the smell of someone else's house on his jacket, the receipt from Millbrook, the conference calls in the driveway, the wallet that had migrated to his jacket pocket, the birthday dinner for the coworker whose name he couldn't immediately produce. I looked at that list for a long time. Then I folded it in half and put it in my purse, inside the small zippered compartment where I kept my dental floss and a spare tampon, the pocket that Brandon had never once reached into in 4 years of marriage, because it was, apparently, not the kind of pocket men investigate. I did not sleep well that night, or the night after that. Here's what nobody tells you about the period between suspecting and knowing. People talk about finding out like it's one moment, the text message, the phone call, the lipstick on the collar, whatever. But for me, it was 3 weeks of existing in a kind of suspended horror, where every conversation with Brandon had this extra layer underneath it, like a piece of music with a wrong note buried deep in the arrangement that you couldn't stop hearing once you'd heard it the first time. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner twice a week and ordered takeout the other nights, like we always had. I asked about his day. He asked about mine. We watched TV. We went to bed. And the whole time, underneath all of it, I was running calculations, cross-referencing timelines, turning over every small inconsistency like a stone I was afraid to look under. I lost 6 pounds in 3 weeks without trying. I know because I stepped on the scale one morning and it showed a number I hadn't seen since my mid-20s. And instead of the mild satisfaction that might normally accompany that, I just felt a cold, hollow sort of recognition. My body was burning through itself because my brain wouldn't stop. Jennifer called me on a Thursday night and I almost told her. I had the words right there, ready to go. "Jennifer, I think Brandon is having an affair. I found a receipt. Something is wrong." And then I swallowed them back down. Not because I didn't trust her. Jennifer had been my best friend since sophomore year of college. She'd stood next to me at my wedding with her bouquet and her absolutely disastrous updo and her eyes full of happy tears. She was the single person in my life I would trust with anything. I swallowed it back down because saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for yet. And because some small, stubborn, stupid part of me was still holding out hope that I was wrong. I was not wrong. The confirmation came on a Friday, which felt almost insultingly ordinary for the day your marriage ends. Brandon had said he was going to the hardware store to pick up weather stripping for the back door, a completely reasonable, completely normal errand that I had no reason to question. He'd been gone about 45 minutes when I went to the kitchen to refill my coffee and noticed he'd left his phone on the counter. Face up this time. I don't know why he left it face up. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe, somewhere under everything, he was tired of carrying the weight of it alone. I wasn't going to look at it. I want to be clear about that. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds telling myself not to look at it, that whatever was on that phone, I couldn't unknow, that once you cross that line, you can't go back to the person you were before you crossed it. I told myself all of that. And then the screen lit up with a text notification, and I looked. The name at the top of the notification was M, just the letter. And the message preview said, "Miss you already. Last night was..." That was all the preview showed. I picked up the phone. His passcode was our wedding anniversary, September 14th, a fact that somehow made everything worse. I opened the messages. I won't give you the full contents of what I read, partly because some of it is too personal to repeat, and partly because the specific words matter less than the shape of the thing, which was this. It had been going on for 5 months. Her name was Melissa. She lived in Millbrook. They had met, based on the earliest messages I could find, at a work event in September, 1 month before Linda's cardiology appointment, 1 month before Brandon came out of that bedroom with the flattened face and the news about the mitral valve. There was a message from October, right around the time I'd been sitting on the porch with my apple cider, thinking, I cannot believe this is actually my life, where Brandon had texted Melissa, "Complicated situation at home, big financial thing, hang with me." Complicated situation at home, big financial thing. I put the phone back on the counter, face up, exactly where he'd left it. I refilled my coffee, I sat down at the kitchen table, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. Not shattered. That's the word people use, shattered. But it wasn't that. It was more like calcification. Like something soft and living hardening into something else entirely, something that would not break because it was no longer capable of breaking in that particular way. He came home 40 minutes later with the weather stripping and a bag of caulk he didn't need. I was still at the kitchen table. He set the hardware bag down and looked at me with the expression of a man who can tell from a woman's stillness that something has shifted, but hasn't yet identified what. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine," I said, tired. He nodded. He put the weather stripping in the utility drawer. He never did install it. It's probably still there. I need to be honest about what the next 2 weeks looked like, because I think if I smooth it over, it becomes a different kind of story, a cleaner story, and that would be a lie. The next 2 weeks were the bottom, absolute bottom. I kept going to work because I didn't know what else to do with my body, but I was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, and I was making small errors at the office, transposed numbers in a report, a meeting I showed up to 20 minutes late, a vendor email I sent to the wrong address. My manager, Denise, pulled me aside on a Tuesday and asked if everything was okay at home, and I said yes, just a lot going on. And she looked at me for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been a manager for a long time and can read the difference between stress and devastation. And she said, "Whatever it is, take care of yourself first. The reports can wait." I cried in the bathroom after that. Not for long, but I cried. I couldn't talk to Jennifer yet. I still wasn't ready to make it real in that particular way. I couldn't talk to anyone from Brandon's side of our life, obviously. I had acquaintances from work I liked, but didn't trust with something this raw. I had my mom back in Indiana, but my mom had her own health stuff going on, and the last thing I wanted to do was add this to her plate when she was already managing her blood pressure and worrying about her retirement. I was, in the most concrete and suffocating sense of the word, alone with this. I slept on my side of the bed while Brandon slept on his, and I stared at the ceiling at 2 a.m. and did the math I didn't want to do. $50,000. My savings. 4 years of careful, deliberate, no excuses saving that I had built from nothing because I had watched my mother work herself to exhaustion for a retirement that wasn't enough. I had given that money to Linda's surgery without hesitation, without conditions, because that was what you did for family. And somewhere in the same window of time, my husband had been texting a woman in Millbrook about the complicated financial situation at home. Was the surgery connected to Melissa? I didn't know. I still don't know with complete certainty. But the timing lived in my chest like a splinter I couldn't get out. I thought about confronting him. I ran the conversation in my head 100 different times, the way I'd say it, the way he'd react, whether he'd deny it or come clean immediately, whether it would matter either way. And every time I ran that conversation, I kept hitting the same wall. If I confronted him now, without anything in place, without any plan, I would be handing him the advantage. He'd control the narrative. He'd have time to move assets, consult an attorney, prepare. He'd get to decide the shape of what happened next. I had spent $50,000 on this family. I was not going to let him decide the shape of what happened next. That thought, that single, cold, clarifying thought, was the first thing in 2 weeks that felt like solid ground under my feet. It was Linda who broke it open, not on purpose. Or maybe on purpose. I've gone back and forth on that, and I'm honestly not sure she knew what she was doing, or whether she did know and did it anyway out of something that looked, in retrospect, almost like conscience. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was sitting in my car in the parking garage after work, not quite ready to go home yet, eating a granola bar and staring at the concrete wall in front of me. I almost didn't answer. I looked at her name on the screen for 2 full rings and thought about what it would mean to answer versus not answer, and then I picked up. "Ashley," she said. "Hi, Linda." A silence. Not long, maybe 4 seconds, but waited. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." My hand tightened on the phone. "Okay." "Brandon called me last week," she said. "He told me he wants to end the marriage. He asked me to. He wanted to know if I'd talk to you. To make the transition smoother, is how he put it." Another pause. I told him I wouldn't do that. I didn't say anything. The granola bar wrapper crinkled in my hand. I also told him, Linda continued, her voice careful and deliberate, that what you did for me, the surgery, everything, was not something that should go unacknowledged, legally or otherwise. She stopped. I don't know if that means anything. I don't know what you're going to do, but I thought you deserved to know what was coming. How long have you known about Melissa? I asked. My voice came out completely steady, which surprised me. A longer silence this time. Since January, she said quietly. January. 2 months. She had known for 2 months, and she had sat across from me at Sunday dinner twice in that time, and she had let me keep cooking those dinners and driving her to follow-up appointments and living inside a marriage that had already been decided for me. Why are you telling me now? I asked. Because, she said, and her voice was old and tired and something else underneath that. You paid for my heart to keep beating. The least I can do is tell you the truth before it's too late to use it. I sat in that parking garage for another 20 minutes after we hung up. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere, 2 levels up, a car alarm went off and then stopped. And then I picked up my phone and called a divorce attorney. The attorney's name was Patricia Okafor, and she had an office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Chicago with a view of the river and a framed needlepoint on the wall that said, "Document everything," in very elegant cursive. I appreciated her immediately. I'd found her through a referral from Denise, my manager, who had noticed my devastation before I'd said a single word about it, who had apparently been through her own divorce 7 years prior and had kept Patricia's card ever since. When I called Denise the morning after Linda's phone call and said, "I need a name," she didn't ask any questions. She just gave me the number. Patricia was 50-something, precise, unhurried in the way of someone who has sat across from enough shattered people to know that rushing them doesn't help. She listened to everything. The surgery, the money, the receipt from Millbrook, the phone messages I'd read, Linda's call in the parking garage. She didn't react to any of it with the expressions people make when they're listening to a soap opera. She just listened, and occasionally wrote something down on a yellow legal pad that looked almost exactly like the one I'd used in my kitchen 2 months before. When I was done, she set her pen down and said, "You transferred the $50,000 from a personal account, not a joint account?" "Personal," I said. "It was my savings, premarital savings mostly. I'd been building it since before we met." She nodded slowly. "And the house, how is it titled?" "Joint," I said. "We bought it together. I put in 40% of the down payment, he put in 60%, but we're on the mortgage together." "Do you have documentation of your down payment contribution?" "I have everything," I said. "Bank statements, wire transfer records, the closing documents. I keep files." I paused. I color code my budget spreadsheets. For the first time, something almost like a smile crossed her face. "Good," she said. "That is genuinely good. You'd be surprised how many people come in here with nothing." We talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, I understood my situation with a clarity that was both devastating and, strangely, stabilizing. Illinois was an equitable distribution state, not a 50-50 state, which meant the court divided marital assets fairly rather than equally. The house would be the central issue. My $50,000 contribution to Linda's surgery was, legally speaking, a gift to a third party, not something I could automatically recover. But Patricia thought we had arguments to make, depending on how the financials shook out. "Don't confront him yet," she said when I stood up to leave. "Not until we've had a chance to pull the financial picture together. The moment he knows you're lawyered up, the clock starts. Right now, time is on your side." I nodded. I paid her retainer from the checking account I had opened, alone, that morning, at a different bank than the one Brandon and I used together. I was done being the person who didn't plan ahead. I kept going home. I kept making dinner twice a week. I kept lying in bed next to Brandon at night, listening to him breathe, thinking about equitable distribution and documentation and the wire transfer records I had saved as PDFs in a folder on my work laptop labeled, innocuously, Home Projects. Patricia filed the initial paperwork on a Thursday, 17 days after I sat in that parking garage eating a granola bar. I was served process at my office, which Patricia had arranged so that Brandon wouldn't intercept the documents at home. My hands were completely steady when I signed the acknowledgement. The paralegal who handed me the envelope looked at me with a kind of careful sympathy, and I smiled at her and said, "Thank you," and meant it. Brandon found out that evening. He came home to find a copy of the divorce petition on the kitchen counter, the same kitchen counter where he would later put his own set of papers. And the energy in that house shifted immediately, like pressure dropping before a storm. I was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, not pretending to do anything else, just sitting there. "You filed," he said. "I filed," I said. He put the papers down. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him recalculating, going through the same mental inventory I'd been going through for weeks, trying to figure out what I knew, how much I knew, how long I'd known it. "Ashley, I'm not doing this tonight, Brandon," I said. My voice was even, completely, solidly even. "I have an attorney. You should get one too." He opened his mouth and then closed it again. And then he went upstairs, and I heard him on the phone, not in the bedroom this time, but in the bathroom with the fan running, which I found almost funny. And I finished my coffee and washed my mug and went to bed. The next 3 months were the legal machinery of ending a marriage, which is its own particular kind of exhaustion. Discovery, financial disclosures, the back and forth between Patricia and Brandon's attorney, a man named Gary Kellerman who had an aggressive style that Patricia described to me, calmly, as loud but not especially effective. Brandon had hired him quickly, probably on Kevin's recommendation or some buddy's referral, without doing much research. That turned out to matter. Brandon's financial disclosure was, let's say, optimistic in certain respects. His savings were lower than I'd expected, genuinely lower, not strategically lower, because it turned out that whatever he'd been spending on Melissa over the past 5 months had added up. Dinners in Millbrook, weekends I'd thought were work trips, a necklace I found on a credit card statement while Patricia's forensic accountant was going through everything. The necklace was $340. I remember that number very specifically. I don't know why that one detail lodged in me the way it did, but it did. The house was the fight. Brandon wanted to sell and split the proceeds. Patricia countered that my disproportionate down payment contribution, combined with the fact that I had been the primary earner for the last 18 months of the marriage — Brandon had been demoted at his company the previous spring, a fact he had minimized when telling me about it, and apparently not mentioned to Gary Kellerman as a factor in the financial picture — entitled me to a larger share of the equity. Gary Kellerman argued Patricia was patient and precise and had documentation for everything, because I had documentation for everything. In the end, we settled out of court, which Patricia had been steering toward from the beginning. I kept the house. I bought out Brandon's share of the equity at a number that reflected his lower down payment contribution, which meant I paid him significantly less than half the equity. He took his 401k, I took mine. The joint accounts were split cleanly. The $50,000 for Linda's surgery, Patricia had made arguments, but ultimately, legally, it was what it was, a gift, not recoverable. I had made my peace with that before we ever got to settlement negotiations. Some things you have to let go of, not because they weren't real or weren't wrong, but because holding on to them costs more than releasing them. Brandon signed the settlement agreement on a Tuesday morning in late April. I know because Patricia called me at 11:15 and said, "It's done." And I was in the middle of a team meeting, and I had to excuse myself and go stand in the stairwell for about 3 minutes, leaning against the painted cinder block wall, breathing. Not crying, just breathing. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in May, 47 weeks from the night I'd sat in my kitchen and made a list on a yellow legal pad. Jennifer took me to dinner that night, a nice place downtown, white tablecloths, a wine list I never usually bothered with. We split a bottle of something Californian that cost more than I would normally spend, and Jennifer looked at me across the candlelight with her characteristic directness and said, "Okay, tell me how you actually feel." I thought about it, really thought about it, rather than giving the polished version I'd been giving people for months. Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, I said, and I just put it down, and my arms still feel the shape of it, but my arms are also mine again. Jennifer raised her glass. I raised mine. We didn't make a toast out of it, no clever words, no celebration of someone else's failure. We just drank, and the wine was good, and the restaurant was warm, and outside the window the Chicago evening was doing what Chicago evenings do in May, which is remind you that winter is genuinely over, and the world is still, stubbornly, beautiful. There's one last thing I want to tell you, because I think it's the part that matters most, even if it's the quietest part. About 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I got a card in the mail, handwritten in the careful, slightly formal penmanship of a woman who had once been a school librarian. The return address was Linda's house in the suburb where Brandon had grown up. There was no long message. Linda was not a woman who wrote long messages. There were 3 sentences. What you did for me was real. I know what it cost you. Both kinds of cost. I'm sorry I didn't do better by you earlier when it would have meant something. That was all. I read it standing at my mailbox in the late afternoon light with the maple in the front yard just starting to come back after winter, new green at the tips of every branch. I stood there for a long time. And then I went inside and I put the card on the kitchen counter, the same counter where the divorce papers had landed 7 months before, and I made myself dinner, and I ate at my own table, in my own house, and the only sound was the refrigerator hum, and the birds coming back outside the window, and the ordinary, irreplaceable sound of a life that belonged entirely to me. Brandon got his fresh start. I got mine. The difference was that mine was built on a foundation I had laid myself, dollar by careful dollar, choice by deliberate choice, and no one, not the man who'd stood at a grill at a 4th of July barbecue and handed me a plate before I asked, not the woman who'd squeezed my hand in a waiting room and let me believe it meant more than it did, could take that away from me. I still color code my budget spreadsheets. My 401k is doing well. The weather stripping on the back door got replaced in June by a contractor I hired myself, and it fits perfectly. And sometimes, on October afternoons when the maples outside are doing that ridiculous postcard thing with the orange and the gold, I sit on the back porch with a mug of apple cider, and I think, I cannot believe this is actually my life. And this time, I know exactly what I mean by it.